her books are extraordinary, and her analysis of the food industry is as spot on now as when she first wrote her first book, which was, when did it not
2004 it came out.
Yeah, well, it hasn't.
No, sadly things have not improved much.
No, they've not improved much. And her recent long write in The Guardian, which won the George Orwell Prize for investigative journalism for showing the social ills in Britain, really, I mean, in a way, it is built on these two books that you come to understand how food is key to what is a lot of the corruption, a lot of the, and you read that long read and understand why there's anti-immigrant feeling, why the Brexit Party has done so well. Anyway, Felicity, you're going to tell us about the food industry, why we should keep them at arm's length. And I know that you want to begin, and I think it's a very good beginning, from the very first chapter in that very first book.
Yes, I was just going to
No, the second book, right?
do a few short readings, partly because I find that my memory for all the detailed facts and figures is failing somewhat, so it's easier to take from the book. But I also wanted to give you a flavour of some of the writing, because some of the subject matter is very grim, but I hope it's reasonably humoured and readable. So this is the second book I wrote. I got to the end of, not on the label in 2003, it came out in 2004, and just as I was finishing I thought, oh, now I understand what it's all about. It's all about American power. But I hadn't really understood that at the beginning of that book, but that's where this book comes in. It does, for me, writing about food is actually finding a way that's very approachable to explain what's happening with modern capitalism, politics, how the world works today. So this is the beginning of the second book. How did it all begin? It was one of those things that crept up on us, and we still can't quite believe it happened. Looking back, we'd been in denial for some time. Then a friend who hadn't seen the family for a while came round and blurted out the bald truth. God, Dodie's got rather fat. In fact, I think that might count as obese. Once said, it had to be admitted. If you looked at Dodie from behind, when he was sitting down, you could see a substantial spare tyre around his 13-year-old middle. He'd become quite lazy too, preferring to lounge in front of the fire rather than play in the garden as he used to. We'd already put him on a diet, but he'd been hooked on a particular brand of instant meal for ages. The packet said, guaranteed real tuna, enriched with omega-3 and omega-6 fats. The feed was not, of course, much to do with tuna. 10% maximum, it said in the small print, with the omega-3 and omega-6 as recent fashionable additions. It was made largely from rendered poultry meal, mixed with fillers of corn gluten meal, ground rice, soy oil, and dried beet pulp. Dodie is our cat. Actually, sadly, was our cat. He's no longer with us. And we know cats do not eat carbohydrates such as ground rice or sugar, nor corn, nor vegetable oils in normal circumstances. Nevertheless, that's what we've been feeding him. It said on the packets that it was scientifically formulated after all, though it might better have claimed that it was economically and politically formulated. Beet pulp is the waste from the sugar industry. Corn gluten meal is what's left over from the manufacture of corn syrup or cornstarch for a vast range of processed foods and drinks. Rice is both one of the most subsidised and dumped crops in the world. Soya is the ubiquitous commodity that finds its way from the Americas into almost every form of comestible, whether for pets or humans. These are the products of corporate power, economic empire, more than any kind of independent science. Now, while there's every reason for domestic pets to eat waste from human production, the absurdity of feeding them types of waste they never evolved to eat that actually makes them fat and sick ought to be easy enough to see, so why do we fall for it? But we apparently weren't alone in our blindness. Feline diabetes has risen dramatically in the last few years in the UK. And actually that's what Dodie, our cat, died of. He died of diabetes. And he was so addicted to the flavourings added by the pet food technologies that we found it really difficult to get him off that food. And there was something particularly shaming about spending good money on diet cat food. Now, there is nothing like an obstinacy of children around the kitchen table, their food likes and dislikes irreconcilably at odds, for bringing to mind the human parallels. Like many a parent, I've often contemplated the paradox. How did Western mealtimes ever become such a source of conflict in an age of plenty? How did we reach the point at which what we eat has become a source of anxiety as much as pleasure? And why are my offspring asking whether it is in fact possible to send broccoli to the starving in Africa? And while we're on the subject of starving, why is food aid to poor countries made up of US corn and soya too? Is that what they really want to eat? Have we entered an age of decadence in which developed countries are bloated on a surfeit of choice for which we are biologically unprepared? But if we are suffering from a surfeit of choice, how come the same small handful of ingredients crop up in everything we eat? And so I wanted to read that to introduce the idea that when you're thinking about food and what's in it, if you grasp the fact that these 5 commodity crops are so heavily subsidised that quite often the taxpayer in America is paying the full value of the corn crop or the sugar crop or the rice and soya crop. And how does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because the food industry is designed to add value by processing. That's where they make their money. They take these incredibly cheap commodity crops, break them down into all sorts of weird and wonderful constituent parts, and then put them back together into things. So you can make much, much more money by selling potatoes as a packet of crisps. And especially if you're government, if you're taking something that your government is subsidising very heavily, you can export that and build your power in other countries, but sell manufactured goods that make much more money. So this is what they call moving up the value chain. And I have a kind of unofficial rule that the more value has been added to a food product, the more nutritional value has been stripped away. So it's the shareholder value, it's not the nutritional value. And one of the things that was interesting to me with the whole sort of thinking about the cat food, the pet food manufacturers went mad when I wrote about this, which was quite interesting. I don't think they've ever been scrutinised before. But I was really trying to understand why and where so much goes wrong about food, which ought to be such a pleasure. And my kids, like other kids, are fussy. I was actually encouraged by the health visitor with my first child to wean her on baby rice. My parents just gave me mashed up bits of their own food with it, as everybody around the world used to do. But we've sort of had our confidence taken away from us right at the beginning. But that, and if you look at the ingredients of baby rice, they're the same things as in the pet food in slightly different forms. It's the same basic commodity. The ingredients has got lots of starch, it's incredibly constipating, it's had vitamins and minerals added back as they've been stripped away from the whole grain when it's processed. But weaning children and getting baby foods and kids on that kind of diet right at the beginning kind of trains them in these extraordinary textures and flavours which I think is one of the key reasons why it's become so difficult for parents to actually feed their children well and why they are so fussy. Now, of course, the other main way that you add value to these raw commodities that are subsidised both by the Americans and by the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe is to feed them to animals. So you make much more money if you move everybody up the food chain. If you look at global population growth and the sort of worry about whether there's going to be enough food, there is enough food as the global population expands if we all eat fairly low down the food chain, if we eat whole, unprocessed foods, not much animal produce. But the whole economic structure post-war that continues now is driving a completely different food system, where instead of eating the grains and getting the protein from those, we are moving up the food chain, producing lots and lots of industrial animals in a way that's completely unsustainable environmentally.
That makes perfect sense, yes. So I remember the first book I ever read when I got interested in food as a political subject. It was called Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times. And it was just the simplest chart at the beginning of this book, which is the potato chart of how much you make if you sell a pound of potatoes. And then as you go up and you process Pringles, I think at that point, was the peak process, which was, you were actually buying potatoes at something at that point, like $250 a ton. And I mean, the enormous profitability that's built into processing is hard to grasp.
It is. It sort of doesn't. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I remember looking very carefully at the figures. Of course, the subsidies were kept very secret for a very long time. One of the earliest bits of work I did at the Guardian on the food system was trying to work out where the subsidies were going. And we did masses of legal fights, freedom of information requests, and forced the European Parliament to release the subsidy figures. The French were particularly motivated because they said it might promote civil unrest if people knew. And the reason being, of course, that actually was a handful of very, very wealthy landowners and not the great small farmer that in your imagination that the subsidies go to, and the same in the States. But when I looked at analysing, there were some very large landowners here who were raking in large amounts of subsidy, but actually the main bulk of the subsidy was going to the processed food manufacturing in terms of subsidising raw ingredients. So it was because they got price guarantees, so it was subsidising in effect concentrated butter fat and all these sort of commodity crops, rather than keeping small farmers on the land. Farmers finding it very, very hard to make any kind of living.
Yeah, there is a sense that you really did think it was subsidising good farming, because it wasn't ever that at all. But I mean, the subsidies in the United States have been much more marked, haven't they? I mean, the soy, the corn, the sugar.
Yes, they're astronomical, and there have been years, and it was particularly true of rice, where literally the whole value of the crop was covered by taxpayers' money. And that's quite a hard thing to get your head around. Why would America do that? And it goes back to the sort of period immediately post-war. I mean, they've got enormous amounts of land. Farmers were encouraged to produce surplus, and then which they couldn't sell in the States. And the American government used it as a way of building its power, I mean, with great benign effect in Europe post-war, because Europe was absolutely starving and on its knees. And they had this Marshall Plan where they exported large amounts of food to us. And that really was the beginning of the globalized, industrialized food system. I mean, we had to, the subsidies went to tobacco too. I mean, they're kind of mad in all sorts of ways. And they subsidised fertiliser and agricultural machinery. So you've got the Americans exporting their intensive system of mechanised production to Europe. And then when Europe was rebuilt and didn't need that anymore, the States wanted to use its foreign policy, its power, to strengthen its position elsewhere, and it introduced these things called Food Aid Public Law 480. And so you got the aid was being shifted to the Middle East, Latin America, places where they were fighting the Cold War. And as each country was sort of brought into that American program, it adopts the American diet. And then you get this extraordinary spread of disease that follows that diet. Wherever you go, you see people shifting from peasant traditions and often being very hungry, so there was suddenly food, which was a good thing, but it was the wrong kind of food. And you see this extraordinary explosion in what they call non-communicable diseases, so heart disease, cancers, tooth decay, obesity, huge crisis of obesity. Which has happened so rapidly that I was in South Africa interviewing the Minister of Health and talking about that there were people, I went to the townships, there were people within one family, over and over again, you'd find where one child was still starving and malnourished, and one was obese. And then this extraordinary shift that had taken place because they were being fed absolutely appalling junk food, and the food industry very cynically has even lower standards when it's exporting to developing countries. So the sort of big brand names here who've cut down on salt and sugar and hydrogenated fat, they're sort of halving it all off in poorer countries.
I mean, I found it interesting to look at the spread of the American way of eating. If you superimpose sort of a chart, a tissue paper on a map, and you look at the spread of the American way of eating, and then you superimpose on that the spread of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, the things match. I mean, they are caused by the one causes the other, and yet we have a medical system which pretends that we have diseases that somehow can be dealt with by pills. And I mean, I know there's going off at an angle from what you're saying, but it is we've got a very corrupted medical system because of that.
Well, we've got a national illness service rather than a national health service, and governments. I mean, it's so interesting that governments aren't in long enough to do too much about it, but also the industry is very powerful and has been a source of considerable tax, although they're now offshoring, and that's a whole other fascinating area that I've looked at, just how the food and drink sector has managed to remove its profits from taxation. But governments find it very hard to tackle. And there is this sort of terror that's been so cleverly promoted by right-wing market fundamentalists about the nanny state, that anything you do is nanny state and that this somehow infringes on your liberties. But there's not much liberty to a child who's obese at 11 and can't run around.
The only food you can buy is the food that causes you to be ill. Well, you were going to talk next, I think, about...
You can't hear me, I'm so sorry. I've got a very quiet voice, yes, I will try. Is everybody having that problem? No. Okay, I'll try harder.
Sorry, my head's gone down.
Yeah, no, I have got a very soft voice, I'm aware of that.
You do? Okay, well... I have a broadcast voice. I mean, you were then going to talk, Felicity, about why chicken has become so ubiquitous and why chicken has been sold to us as the supreme white healthy meat, because it's really not like that at all, is it? It's got nothing to do with health.
No, and chicken has been the curse of my professional life, because I started writing about it and then I really wanted to stop writing about it, but it just won't go away. And the reason it won't go away, I suddenly realised it's actually chicken is the equivalent of sugar in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. That was the economic driver of the world. That was what was behind the slave trade, the triangular trade, or coffee and coffee houses and politics. I mean, there have been different commodities at different periods, which have really been what world politics and economics is about. And in the 20th century and early 21st century, it's chicken. That is the defining commodity of our era. And of course, post-war, immediately post-war, it was a luxury item, something you very rarely ate, and it probably was quite tough and stringy, and you had different ways of cooking it mostly. The chicken industry emerges because you've got cheap feed, you've got all that American grain, and then you've got various things that are the equivalent of Ford managing to make the mass-produced car from bolted-on ingredients, and that's really what happened to chicken. They worked out how to breed it so that it grew very fast, and how to make it absolutely uniform so that it could fit machines. So when you go into an abattoir today, the chickens arrive and they're turned upside down and shackled and then put on a conveyor belt that goes through these vast factories, taking it non-stop. It doesn't stop at any point. It's going on that conveyor belt just like a car factory through each process, from slaughter to evisceration, plucking, and chopping up and packing. It's all semi-automated. So the two things, the automation and the cheap feed, are what makes it possible. And I was just going to read a little bit about the life of the chicken because it is something that I haven't been able to get away from, and people are still surprised when they hear it. So 15 years on. If you know it already, I'm sorry, but the modern broiler chicken has been bred to fatten in the shortest time possible. The name actually derives from a combination of two traditional methods of cooking, broiling and roasting. The broiler farms divide the year up into a series of 8-week cropping periods, and they call them crops, they don't call them birds. So each crop of chicken takes about 38 to 42 days to grow, from chick to 2 kilogram bird ready for slaughter. Then in England, they take a week to clean and disinfect the sheds before the next crop is introduced. Crucially, in America, they don't bother with the cleaning in between. The units are not cleaned. So after 2 to 3, they're not cleaned during the cropping. So after 2 to 3 weeks, the wood shavings on the floor of the sheds are completely covered with poultry manure, and the air is acrid with ammonia. Everything is automated. Computers control not just the heating and ventilating systems, but also the dispensing of feed and water. And the feed and water are medicated with drugs to control parasites or with mass doses of antibiotics as necessary. Sheds these days typically hold 30,000 to 50,000 birds. Space and heat cost money, so the more birds you pack in, the greater your yield. The UK government guidelines currently advise there should be a maximum stocking density of 34 kilograms of bird per square metre of floor space. But in fact, very few people stick to that, and most supermarkets permit stocking densities up to 38 kilograms per square metre. So to explain to you what that means when each mature bird has reached its full size before they're collected for slaughter, they each have an area less than a sheet of A4 paper. So that's sort of what they've got to stand on. Now, if you picture your chicken from a supermarket, that's not much, they barely fit in. By the time the birds reach the end of their lives, the sheds are so crammed that they can hardly move. Animal welfare groups have regularly video recorded signs of acute stress in birds, including feather pecking and cannibalism of dead chickens. Mortality rates are very high. 2 companies, both American, Ross Breeders and Cobb, supply 80% of the breeding stock for commercial broilers around the whole world. So imagine how quickly disease can spread through that very tiny gene pool. Much research has been devoted to genetic selection to produce the most efficient bird. The RSPCA, which says that it sees the suffering of broiler chickens as one of the most pressing welfare issues in the UK today, produced a little pamphlet called Behind Closed Doors, which showed the effect of that genetic selection. More eloquent than any description was a series of matching pairs of tiny photographs in the margin of each page. The top photograph shows a normal egg-laying hen, taken at an interval of a few days as it grows from chick to maturity. And underneath is a parallel picture of the broiler chicken taken at the same intervals. So the egg chicken is obviously growing much more naturally. The broiler chicken is genetically selected to grow incredibly fast. By day 9, the broiler chick's legs can barely keep its oversized breast off the ground. By day 11, it's puffed up to double the size of its egg-laying cousin. It looks like an obese 9-year-old standing on the legs of a 5-year-old. By day 35, it looks more like a weightlifter on steroids, and it dwarfs the egg-laying hen. Now, the consequence of that is they actually can't hold themselves up by the end. So you get a huge amount of lameness, and you can tell from when you're buying a chicken, there are what they call hock burns, these little red marks on the knee joints on the bird, which means they haven't actually been able to hold themselves up. Partly there's not enough space, but also their legs just can't carry the weight. We've bred them to have these enormous breasts, because in Europe we've been sort of trained to want to eat white breast meat. I personally think it's dry and doesn't taste as much, and I'd much rather have a leg or something. But we've sort of been encouraged to eat in a completely new, very, very unnatural way. And because the birds are kept so intensively, most flocks have problems with disease. So there's a heavy use of antibiotics. We're trying in Europe to cut down on that, but they still have to use them quite frequently. And they're using the same antibiotics in chickens that they're using, that we need for human health, and they're breeding tremendous amounts of resistance. We've done lots of investigations on The Guardian about the levels of disease in industrial poultry meat. And at the moment, about 2/3 of all retail samples of chicken are contaminated with a particularly nasty food poisoning bug called Campylobacter, which is almost endemic in the flocks in the UK. It's the way the system works.
What's the name of the bacteria?
Campylobacter.
Is that like
Campy.
H. pylori?
It's not. It's a different bug. And in America, they've got a problem with salmonella. We don't have that problem so much here because we vaccinate birds, and we seem to have got roughly on top of it, although it is just beginning to re-emerge. But even more disturbing, and I should say you can kill Campylobacter by cooking properly, but the problem comes with contamination when you're touching a raw bird and you touch the taps or the utensils or whatever. And it causes a tremendous amount of illness. Hundreds of thousands of people are made ill every year. Occasional deaths. It can be lethal in people who are particularly vulnerable.
Because they haven't cooked it sufficiently?
Well, it's always quite hard to know where you got something, isn't it? But it would be. It's probably from raw handling rather than if you. But yes, if you don't cook properly, you can get food poisoning that way. And we publish lots of investigations, and one of the things about the factory system is that if a couple of birds in a flock have got this Campylobacter bug, when they come through this conveyor belt system in the abattoir, it's bound to infect everything because they get dipped in these great vats of boiling water to loosen the feathers. They change the water once a day. If you're lucky, some of my investigations where the factory's been running so fast to meet supermarket orders, they've actually not changed the water for 3 days. So, they're all going, one bird in there, nice warm soup of breeding bugs. After that, they go through this whirring. I've worked in one of these factories. They're rather.
I was just going to say that, Felicity, just to remind everybody if they don't know,
they're incredible
that you
places.
actually did have to go and work in
I
one.
did have to go and
Unknown,
work
obviously,
because they were cheated. This was somebody had alleged that they were taking West Country Sainsbury's chicken labels and putting them on imported Dutch meat that had been injected with water. And I had to go and see it happen to protect my source. And they're kind of amazing places in a Heath Robinson-like way, but also just very, very grim. And that was actually where I first got onto the whole issue of migrant labour in the food sector, because there are 19, I think it was, different nationalities doing the night shift in terrible conditions and clearly illegally employed. They were turning up in filthy vans with no seats, 20 or 30 piling out, a lot of aggro on the line at night. And a lot of fraud because we're selling it too cheap, and when you sell stuff that cheap, people have to cheat. They cut corners and cheat.
But you're describing this, let's go back to the hygiene thing, and think of the discussion that's now going on about if we have a trade deal with the Americans, we're going to have chlorinated chicken, and you might think, gosh, that would be good, wouldn't it? Chlorinated chicken, but that's not, of course, quite the way it is it?
It's funny how phrases catch, isn't it? And the industry is sort of furious about people saying chlorinated chicken, and that there's nothing wrong with it. So we've got, it's about like the sort of mad cow disease in the burgers, isn't it? Where people say, oh, it's all a bit of a joke and I don't mind eating, I go to America and I don't die when I eat chicken. Americans are all eating chicken, they're not dying. Well, actually, some of them are. An awful lot of them are getting sick. And so there's a different attitude in the States, which is that you clean up at the end. You accept that this process, if you're going to make really, really cheap meat, it's going to be a dirty process. And so you clean up at the end. But the Campylobacter and Salmonella bugs are carried in feces. So you're dealing in chicken poo, that's what it is. And they disinfect it at the end, accepting that they can't kind of eliminate contamination. Europe has refused to allow it for meat. And the Americans are saying, but you use chlorinated washes on your salad, so you're hypocrites. Or it's in your water, so what's the problem? And the problem, of course, is that the dose is kind of rather important. It is in water, but it's in water, I think it was 5 milligrams per litre. It's the maximum allowed by the World Health Authority. And they set that maximum because obviously there's a huge benefit to having clean water, which has had its bugs killed, and using a very dilute solution of chlorine. But chlorination leaves chlorinated compounds, some of which are shown in animal tests to be carcinogenic, cancer-causing. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, sets strict limits for how much chlorine you can use to disinfect water systems to sort of reduce the risk of cancer. The washes they use in the States for chicken are 50 milligrams per litre, so it's much more concentrated. You can't actually really say that's the equivalent because with water you're actually drinking it. The idea is not that you drink, we don't know what happens to the chlorinated compounds that they've left on chicken. Nobody's really done any work on it. So much in the food industry is they kind of come up with a solution to a mess they've caused. And it's not really tested or checked. And then it's really hard to find the information, so there's such a lot of nonsense talked about it. And it took me weeks to find somebody who'd actually tell me what level of chlorination was allowed in chlorine. And with salad vegetables, it's about 15 to 20 milligrams per litre, which I actually exposed in this book, and the industry stopped doing it. Mostly they use wash and spring water now because people just didn't want it. You don't want something that you think is terribly healthy like salad, and why does it need to be disinfected? So the Americans are kind of cheating rather in their conversation about it.
But it's not just the cheating, is it, about the chlorination? It's the fact that, as you said at the beginning, it's a way of rearing chickens in ways that are even worse than the ones you describe in Europe. Very, very few controls at all. And I mean, it's a self-regulated industry for the most part. And so the factories, as you say, they don't, there's very little checks there. So that basically chlorination in the American system is just a way of covering up doing anything you goddamn like to make the chicken as cheap as possible.
Yes, I mean, I think the difficulty Europe has is so the European Union has led the way, partly driven by the UK, on animal welfare and certain types of conditions, and it has tried to have this different approach, which they call the precautionary principle, where rather than waiting to see if it goes wrong and assuming it's safe until you find out 20 years later, oops, it caused cancer, you actually sort of take a much more cautious approach and say, we won't do that unless we absolutely have to. So they have tried to clean up what they call from farm to fork and to have a more sort of, I think, a better view of how you should farm and keep things clean. The reason the argument continues is that nobody can quite work out whose chicken is more contaminated than whose. So, the Americans say, yours is worse than ours, you've got more Campylobacter than us, which I think is true. And we say, you've got more Salmonella. And when there's such a lot of nonsense put out in the statistics, when I've looked at them, the truth is you can't compare the statistics. They're collected in completely different ways in the States and the UK. They just don't convince us. But, again, it's sort of, there's so little honesty about this thing.
But the story you're telling makes it sort of extraordinary, what has happened in the terms of the perception of chicken as healthy. People tell me proudly they've given up red meat and are eating chicken. And you think, well, that's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. You'd be better off having a steak. Because, it is one of the worst ways of rearing an animal.
It's one of the worst ways of rearing an animal, and its contribution to climate change is enormous. When you think of the deforestation, the demand for soya, particularly now that you've got countries like China wanting to follow the Western diet and increase their poultry consumption, the demand for soya has gone through the roof. And that's what's driving deforestation, and it's what's driving the current deforestation in Brazil, which had pulled back after a lot of effort and fuss but Trump putting sanctions on the Chinese. The Chinese aren't buying soy from the Americans anymore, so Brazil is trying to meet the gap, which is enormous. And so you get all these really devastating knock-on effects from that kind of diet. But the other thing I think is so fascinating about chicken is that we've actually changed the composition of the meat. And there's this wonderful book, McCants and Wilson, the sort of Bible Composition of Foods, which is the public chemist analyst's list of tables of what the composition of food is. And when you look back to the post-war period, at what a chicken was made up of, it was more protein and less fat. And now it's much fattier, and the type of fat in a chicken is completely different. There are much fewer omega-3 long-chain fatty acids because it's eating a junk food diet. You know, so it's an obese bird, you're eating obese animals, and all those sort of really vital nutrients that we used to get. So it's the chicken that, and there is some hope here. I was just doing very gloomy. Organic chickens, which are too expensive to eat all the time. You can, well, so let's come on to that fully in a bit. Organic chickens have 12 weeks, so instead of a month, they get 3. And they're allowed out, and they eat grubs and insects and seeds. And that is what makes the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which we now know are so linked, that our lack of them in an industrialised modern diet is so linked to such a range of degenerative diseases. And we're completely out of kilter with it. But the food we're producing is producing, you know, even when you think you're eating something that's low fat, good protein, it's had its composition changed. Shall we talk about what we should eat?
Yeah, let's be cheerful before we, as we're getting to the point where we need questions. So, yes, that's the question. People say, oh, it's so complicated then. What should you do?
Yes, I think it's very simple. It's very simple. You should eat food. And this is the great author, put it like this. And actually, I realised he borrowed it from this wonderful campaigning nutritionist called Caroline Walker. She actually said it firstly. Eat food, mostly plants. And Michael Pollan added this thing, you know, if your grandmother wouldn't have recognised an ingredient, it's probably not nice. And you know, that sounds so simple, but actually so much of what we're eating is not really food anymore. It's so deracinated, or
food-like substances.
Food-like substances. And you know, we need to eat less meat as a global population. I think that's a very personal choice. I think the question really is how important is it to you? So how much time are you prepared to give it, and how much of your income are you prepared to spend on it? Now, for the lowest socioeconomic groups who really don't have enough money, that's very difficult. But for the vast majority of other groups, we don't seem anymore to value it enough to spend a reasonable amount of our income on it. So post-war, people typically spend, on average, it was 30% of their income went on food. And now it's less than 10%. And we're happy to buy a £2 cup of coffee, but we balk at spending the extra on a different kind of chicken. So I think it is about values and priorities, with this big caveat, which is the thing that makes me very angry, which is that the type of jobs we're creating mean that even people in work on low incomes just can't afford good food. So and when I've spent a lot of time interviewing people, I always interview the food workers. I mean, whenever I'm working undercover or if I'm interviewing migrant workers or in the fields and factories, and they can't afford to buy the food they're working on, if it's vegetables. And they've all talked about, you know, they buy the white sliced bread, which is almost completely nutritionally depleted. And you know, the special offer junk food, because that's what they can afford.
So the organic chicken is much better.
I think an organic chicken is better in terms of its composition, in terms of the life it's led. They all go through the same factories. And that there is there was a terrible moment, and not on the label at the beginning, when I'm in the chicken factory being shown around, and I'd say, oh, but what about organic chickens, hoping. And
So is it going back to re-educating people to say that you're spending £2 on your cup of coffee, to say, why don't you spend that valuable money on to buying something a bit more organic, which might be better?
I think it is about people rethinking and understanding more, and letting. But I think the reason for choosing that bit about pet food and baby rice is to say, actually, this is about big politics, and we can beat ourselves up about changing our diets and find it quite hard. And I found it hard with my kids, even though I'm very committed to good food. But actually, you've got to change the political system. You know, and we're eating what we're eating because of what the most powerful governments have chosen to promote, and you need that to change. I mean, you can't on your own change that. But I think what consumers do, just as the Extinction Rebellion is doing now and making everyone late. But if enough people say we don't want this, that and that's how you use your consumer power. Because it's about it is about we can improve what we eat, but we've still got what are the figures on the latest figures this week were on obesity in children. I mean,
It's huge because it's been currently in the news, hasn't it, again?
yeah, I've forgotten what the figures I was thinking.
Isn't it also like, because you say, okay, this is, you mentioned that already with the government, but it's, I think the individual choice, because it's part of the wider picture, because the foods which we say, oh, the kind of like people on lower incomes can only afford that, has to do because they are subsidized, they're made, they be addictive as well, because they're substances which they add, which I have seen with children, they go for particular foods because they have added things which make them
which are
highly
very,
addictive,
very,
which is actually, if
tasty,
you think about it, maybe children already addicted to certain kinds of food. You mentioned a bit with baby food, but it's ongoing in every stage. And this is a food we fight probably if we parents want to provide good food every day, then not to eat, from the crisps to anything. And but I think the thing wouldn't be we have to create like I think a different system in the sense of like this is not a real competition about organic versus the other, because I think we can have healthy food which is not organic if it's not produced on subsidized ingredients, so the prices are subsidized, put down, isn't it? So that's why these prices are there in the supermarket, and people are made to choose that. It's not a choice really.
And I absolutely agree with you. I don't think everything has to be organic. But I think with meat, I think I probably, for me personally, I wouldn't. There is this whole welfare issue with antibiotics and so on. So I do eat organic meat or meat that comes from a farmer, and I buy direct from farmers. But fruit and vegetables, we can have much healthier diets, but it's very hard if you're bringing children up in an obesogenic environment. So when it sounds as though you've got children, and when mine went to school and everybody else had crisps, why haven't I got crisps? And they went through phases of total rebellion, eating sweets all the time. They're now grown up and they all cook and they all love good food. So there is hope, but it's been a long haul.
It's also sometimes not just a matter of choice. I love when you talk about your cat, how difficult it was for your cat to be weaned of this pet food that it's been given. But for us as well, when we think from a baby, having had our taste buds compromise really with this thing, and we get used to it. And I did an experiment with myself, having gone raw food for a while, and then I fell off the wagon when I went on holiday. For a while, for the holiday, be okay. And it's been hell going back to the stuff because my taste bud got used to all the exciting thing, and a lot of the food are produced under laboratory conditions first. So therefore it's very calculated what ingredients we're going to play with to create the most excitement, whether it's about teenagers and so on. So it's easy to say the power of choice, but somehow there's something within us that oversteps this power of choice, and suddenly instead of reaching for the celery, I find coming back with boxes of something very different from celery, and which has been so laboratorized, but which tastes so good.
Yeah, well, the food chemists are very clever, and they talk about organoleptic properties. They do literally sort of play around with the melting point of this bit of the chocolate. But it is a very addictive way.
Can I
of
just say
producing
something
food.
about organic food? That is that when I live up in Yorkshire, I am confident of where I buy real fruit and vegetables from. I will never have that confidence in town. There are places we shop up in York, out of York, where the fields are there and the food is there, and you know exactly where it's from. I sadly do not believe organic produce in supermarkets. I don't totally believe farmers markets in central London. Maybe I'm, I have an nasty mind. But
Well, people have been caught selling stuff.
I'm
It's
saying
organic.
that there are at least 3 or 4 places, more than that, up outside in Yorkshire where you know that the food is definitely grown locally. I have trouble with organic because it's the same range. But that's a different issue. But I know that it is grown locally. And if I really want to, I can walk out from the farm shop and walk up the lane to the field where it's growing. And there are lots of places like that.
But in a society where, what is it now, more than 50% of us live in urban areas,
Yes.
you've got to try and have a standardised system. And what you said earlier is perfectly true. It doesn't have to be organic. If you're growing it without in a proper way, in proper soil, or bringing your chicken up in decent conditions, the organic can be almost irrelevant. But as you say, Leslie,
I really don't believe anything packaged in weight frozen plastic that says organic.
well, I mean,
I'll give it the
I've been a
benefit of
reporter
the
long
doubt.
enough to have a certain faith in the Soil Association and their I mean, it isn't perfect, and it's a long way from being perfect, but it is, I think, probably the best certification system we've got, or the biodynamic one.
Well, I think the other thing is when I met organic farmers, they've got, there are exceptions. So this is a generalisation, but most people who go into it with quite a broad view of what they're trying to do. So they, from my experience, they tend not to be the people who are cheating on the minimum wage for their workers. They want to think about climate and their carbon footprint, and they want to, they start from this thing which has been so unfashionable for so long. They start with the soil and these incredible complex ecologies of soil, which conventional farmers have been encouraged again post-war, and it grew out of, they had all these chemicals produced for weapons in war, and then when they didn't need them for war anymore, they turned them into pesticides. And again, this is a very American approach where you blast everything with pesticides and you destroy the soil. And organic farmers mostly are trying to farm for the future as well as the present. And so I do have a lot of faith in most of them. I just think, I know there's a huge affordability issue.
Sorry, I don't think you meant the farmers, you meant more probably people selling, because that's, I think, where the problem starts, because obviously everybody who's been on a farmer's market said, well, just like because the carrots are dirty and in the shop they're washed, is that how do you know? So it's basically you have to have a system of in a big place, a system of say trust. And trust is one thing. Trust comes from if they are respected, kind of like some control enforced, kind of regulatory rules. But obviously, as so much money is to be made, again, also there, it is also like quite tempting, is it? Like if you just say cut the corner, and that's the big problem there at all. Because in the end of the day, I think for me it boils back to. I talk to older people, which In the old days, we spent more than half, if not 3/4 of the income on food. What do we spend nowadays? We spend most of the income in this place definitely on rent,
And
which
food.
wasn't a factor in the old days.
And food.
And I think that is the big problem, because the money goes there, and the poorer you are, the more of your income goes into that. And there is, this can only be changed politically. There is no will, I can't see, not really. So this will not change, because I do think there is enough money, even if you are on little income, to get food, which is, but the whole system is rigged against it.
Well, I think that's true. And the other thing that people on really low incomes, they're often passionate, a lot that you're trying to do that, but people say, well, I can't, lentils are incredibly cheap. But actually, you need to be able to afford fuel to cook, and actually that's a huge problem for people on low incomes. They actually can't, they're making a choice between putting the money in the meter, where they have to pay much higher rates for their electricity because they've got more money, or endless injustices, and they maybe make a choice that they've got one room with several kids, I'm going to have the telly on and I'm not going to have the cooker on, and these are real impossible choices.
Well, so much of it comes down to people just not having enough. It just is inequality, and we've had governments for quite a long time who've made this political choice that a lot of people are going to be very poor.
I think that there is optimism in the pessimism, if you see what I mean. So one of the things, the climate crisis can't be ignored much longer. It's going to get so expensive to deal with that the whole way we produce food is going to come under scrutiny, I think. And the obesity crisis is so enormous, and the impact on the health service. Already it costs 6 to 7 billion a year to treat obesity-related diseases. As that, and it's just growing and growing and growing. So I think even those who are very anti-state intervention are going to start realising that you actually have to do something, and that has to be government action.
Slightly off the track, it's a problem I have. You're using the word organic. When I was at school, I studied organic chemistry, and that was I eventually discovered,
organic,
after I'd done the A-level, that it was about the carbon atom, then suddenly it comes along as organic. What is actually the definition of a food being organic? Is it the fact that it's not had pesticides on it, or that it's been somehow treated a different way?
Well, it will depend which country you're in. So all these words are quite political, and how much protein you're said to need will depend on which country you're in. The American government says that the human body needs much more protein than the British government thinks. So these are all very political.
Well, you see the size of Americans. No
There are basic standards in the process. We talk about British, and we're in Britain, and if you're buying it, most of it's going to be here. Although there are importers, but there are basic standards. They are certain pesticides prohibited, artificial fertilizers, pesticides prohibited. They have much tougher standards on antibiotic use than when you can use them if you're breeding livestock, and long withdrawal periods before you can slaughter if you use them for livestock. They have a whole set of, even down to the processing, which additives. They have a long list of additives that are prohibited from any processed food that's called organic. So, you can go and have a look on the Soil Association website. They are quite wise standards. Yes, I take your point that some people who cheat, but
I would be very challenged by anything that said it was organic if it was frozen or in a tin. I'm frozen or in a tin. I'm much likely to buy something that's not, when I say organic, it would be vegetables or fruit. The thought of buying something that's organic that is then packaged seems to me.
But except, for example, I would buy tinned organic tomatoes because I use a lot of tinned.
No, but it's not really organic.
But it is really organic. It is really from tomatoes grown to soil association standards.
Yes, but it's all being processed in a factory and then put in a tin.
I think there's minimal processing. I can't imagine life without tin tomatoes. But there's sort of minimal processing. What we talk, what's
But I mean, organic Coca-Cola would be something else. Wouldn't it? I mean, what exactly would be the point of that? And there are things like that.
It's interesting.
there are a lot of things. There are a lot of vegan foods, which are just they're not food, and I despair of people who are so well intentioned, who want to eat differently, who care about the climate, care about animal welfare, but have completely fallen for this sort of marketing.
You know, when you say that they're not food, I think that's a Felicity Lawrence opinion, because in this American book I was reading about GM food and labelling, right at the beginning they decided to talk about cloning, and they said the American definition, at least at the time, was food is anything that you could eat.
Anything.
Yeah, I mean that's what I said. And if you when it comes to cloning as well, I was thinking, right, okay, so let's ask the Food Regulatory Agency about cloning, and they basically said, seeing as cloning is a copy of food, it is food. You know.
Well, I mean, it is my opinion. I mean, all of this is my
No, I mean I agree with you, but yeah.
But I think we should learn from history. There are so many things that have been invented as the miracle arts of, whatever. I mean, take margarine. It's not food. It's not food, and it turns out it made people very ill, and that it was the way it was manufactured, produced hydrogenated fats. It was being sold as better than butter for your heart, and it actually was much worse. It created trans fatty acids, which was disastrous, and it took. Well, actually, it's
still here, isn't it?
It's still here, and it's now watered down, so you get low-fat spread, which is just the same rubbish with water and starch. And they charge you twice as much. How can we be buying that stuff? But it took so long for that new food that seemed so miraculous. It was invented in Napoleonic times to feed the army on the move because butter went rancid. But it's horrible stuff. And there's all these new foods. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I mean, corn has caused huge problems with allergies. We haven't evolved to eat these things, and we evolved much more slowly than the food industry is inventing them. So, I mean, I just think, why? We've got plenty of good food. Why invent rubbish?
Concerning margarine,
Yes.
it was, I think, in the 2000s that people generally found out that trans fats were a problem. So I spent the 20 years before that avoiding margarine and being shouted at by and lectured by everybody else about my health. The reason I was avoiding it was that in the early 80s I was studying biochemistry. And our biochemistry lecturer explained that when you hydrogenate fats to make them more solid, they use a chemical process instead of a biological process, and so half of what's created is trans, not cis. And trans fats are nowhere found in nature, so the biochemistry lecturer opined that since we had no idea what these were going to do, it would be a good idea not to eat them. And that was in 1982.
Well, and very carefully worded in my book is the description of how Unilever behaved, because I do get sued quite frequently, sadly, because they knew that trans fats were a problem long before they stopped selling them, and they took them out of flora because that was the healthy heart thing, but didn't take them out of their other products, which I think is unforgivable. And they took much longer to take them out of products going to developing countries.
It shows how misplaced our trust is. They know perfectly well, and they just string us along for as long as they can.
I don't think
Until somebody like you exposes it, frankly.
I think we ought to be a lot more cynical about it. I mean, about this, the vegan fat. It's horrid of me to call it that, but I mean, you think all these young idealistic people in this way, as you say, and you think, well, just be a bit cynical about the food industry, because the food industry can just make this stuff from this, just a variation on the ingredients they were using anyway to make crap. But you can just charge a fantastically higher margin.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that we're going to close. The bar's open, the exhibition will be open, and I'm sure that you're going to be here for a few more minutes if anyone wanted to pursue anything.
is slightly less formal. And I really want to thank them so much, because if I'd known, I'd have probably asked them to stay here till 6 o'clock. But I do know it's a very interesting topic, and I have very strong views on it myself.